A millionaire wed a woman in coma for his grandfather's will. But she suddenly opened her eyes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The night was heavy with silence inside St. Mary's Hospital. In a private wing shielded from the public, the glow of machines reflected across polished floors. At the center of the room lay a young woman with pale skin and delicate hands resting motionless on the sheets. Her name was Elena. After a car accident, she had been in a coma for months. Most of the world had forgotten her existence. But tonight, she was about to become a wife. Alexander, a man whose last name commanded entire industries, stood at the foot of her bed. He was tall, immaculately dressed, his sharp jawline shadowed under the dim light. His eyes, however, revealed no warmth. He did not come here for love. He came here for legacy. His grandfather's will was merciless. To inherit the empire, Alexander had to marry before the old man passed away. To his family, it was a test of responsibility. To Alexander, it was a cage. But Alexander had found a loophole. A marriage that would be legally binding yet emotionally vacant. A woman who could not object, who could not demand his heart. Elena, a silent bride chosen not out of affection, but out of calculation. The priest's voice trembled as he whispered the vows. "Do you, Alexander, take Elena to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The words echoed absurdly in a room where only one soul could answer. Alexander's jaw tightened. He forced the words out. "I do." The nurse slipped a simple gold band onto Elena's finger, her hand limp against the pillow. Alexander stared at it, the weight of irony pressing down on him. A wedding ring meant to symbolize love was now reduced to an emblem of power and survival. When the papers were signed, the lawyer who represented the family gave a curt nod. "Congratulations, Mr. Alexander. You have fulfilled the condition. The inheritance will proceed as outlined." "No." Alexander turned away, exhaling a breath he had been holding. This was supposed to be easy. A transaction, nothing more. No one would ever know. Elena would never wake up. He reached for the chair beside the bed, sitting heavily as the machines continued their steady rhythm. For a fleeting second, his gaze softened. He studied her face, framed by strands of dark hair. She looked fragile, untouched by the greed and cruelty that defined his world. He muttered under his breath, "I am sorry for dragging you into this." The night deepened. Somewhere down the hall, a clock struck midnight. The empire was secured. The family would be satisfied, and Alexander believed his heart would remain untouched. But destiny was already stirring. Hidden beneath closed eyelids, Elena's fingers twitched faintly, as if her soul was beginning to resist the silence. And soon, the man who had chosen her as nothing more than a name on a contract would discover that love, justice, and truth could never be contained by a piece of paper. The morning after the secret wedding, the city skyline glowed with cold sunlight reflecting off the glass towers of Alexander's corporate empire. From his office on the top floor, the world looked small, like toy cars moving along the streets below. Yet inside Alexander's chest, there was no triumph. The marriage papers were filed, the inheritance secured, but an invisible weight pressed heavier than any boardroom negotiation. In a locked drawer sat the contract. The ink had barely dried, but the document already felt like a chain around his neck. His grandfather's conditions had been met, yet Alexander knew that every word on that paper was a lie. He had taken vows in front of God and law with a woman who could not speak, could not consent, could not even open her eyes. Down the road, in St. Mary's Hospital, Elena remained as she had been for months. The staff wheeled her through quiet corridors. Her body fragile, but alive. Nurses adjusted her blankets, checked her vitals, and whispered with pity about the mysterious young bride who had married in silence. To them, she was a tragic figure. To Alexander, she was both shield and wound. That afternoon, Alexander visited again. His expensive shoes clicked across the hospital floor, echoing in the sterile air. When he entered the room, the soft beeping of machines welcomed him like a reminder of the bargain he had struck. Elena's ring gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. For the first time, he noticed how delicate her hand was. The sight unsettled him. He sat beside her bed, his fingers tightening around the contract in his jacket pocket. A nurse came in to check on Elena. She smiled politely at Alexander. "Your wife is stable today. She is showing no changes, but her body is fighting well." "Ah." The word wife caught him off guard. He forced a nod. "Thank you." When the nurse left, silence thickened. Alexander leaned forward, studying Elena's face. She was a stranger, yet now bound to him in the most sacred vow society recognized. He whispered low, almost ashamed. "You do not know me, Elena. And I did not marry you for love. But somehow, you hold the key to everything I have ever been forced to chase." His phone buzzed. It was his grandfather's attorney. Alexander stepped into the hallway to answer. "The family board has accepted the marriage certificate. Your position as heir is secure. All that remains is for your grandfather to sign the final transfer before his health worsens." Alexander replied curtly, "I understand." He ended the call, but his hand trembled slightly. He realized then that he had orchestrated the perfect illusion, yet it left him hollow. Later that night, Alexander stood in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. The contract marriage was supposed to free him, but instead it had created a haunting tie. The image of Elena's still face lingered in his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the burn of the liquid could not drown the echo of the nurse's words. "Your wife." In the quiet of the room, Alexander spoke to himself, though no one could hear. "This is temporary. She will never wake. Once the estate is mine, I will set her free." But deep down, even he knew the truth. Fate had its own plans, and the woman he thought would remain silent forever was about to change his life in ways no contract could contain. It was 3 weeks after the quiet hospital wedding. Alexander had kept his visits discreet, slipping into St. Mary's Hospital late at night when most of the staff were gone. To anyone watching, he appeared like a dutiful husband, checking on his wife's condition. But in truth, every visit was an attempt to silence the guilt that gnawed at him. That evening, a thunderstorm rattled the windows. Rain lashed against the glass as Alexander stepped into Elena's room. The steady hum of machines was almost comforting, a reminder that she remained unchanged. He loosened his tie, sank into the chair beside her bed, and rubbed his forehead. "Another deal closed today," he muttered. "Another battle won, and yet here I am, sitting with someone who does not even know my name." He glanced at her hand, at the gold ring glinting faintly under the fluorescent light. The symbol mocked him. In the corporate world, he could control outcomes, dictate terms, and bend rivals to his will. But here, with this silent woman, he felt powerless. Lightning flashed, flooding the room with sudden brightness. And then, it happened. A small movement. Elena's fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Alexander froze, thinking it was his imagination. But then her eyelids fluttered, slow and uncertain, as if her body was struggling against invisible chains. He shot to his feet, heart pounding. "Elena?" His voice cracked, the name foreign on his tongue. He leaned closer, gripping the bedrail. Her chest rose with a deeper breath than usual. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time in months, her eyes flickered open. The pale brown of her irises glistened in the dim light, confused but alive. She blinked, struggling to focus. The machines beeped faster, registering her sudden change. Alexander's world tilted. His carefully built wall of control crumbled in an instant. "No, this cannot be," he whispered. The plan, the contract, the security of his inheritance, it all depended on her silence. And now, she was staring at him, dazed, vulnerable, yet undeniably awake. Her lips moved, dry and fragile, forming a whisper. "Where am I?" Alexander's throat went dry. For a moment, he could not speak. Then, forcing calm into his voice, he said, "You are safe. You are in the hospital." Her gaze drifted down to her hand. She saw the ring, her brows furrowing weakly. "Am I married?" The question struck like a blade, Alexander hesitated too long. His silence was answer enough, and her eyes filled with the first trace of fear. Nurses rushed in, alerted by the alarms. One of them gasped, "She is awake. After all this time." They adjusted the machines, shone a light into her eyes, and recorded her vitals with frantic energy. Alexander stepped back, his heart racing. Every part of his plan unraveled before him. He should have felt relief that Elena lived, that his so-called wife had returned from the shadows of death. But instead, he felt dread, because the truth of their marriage was a ticking bomb. And now the woman he had bound to himself for greed had opened her eyes to a reality she never chose. As the storm raged outside, Alexander stood by the door, watching Elena struggle to breathe words into the room. And deep inside, he knew nothing would ever be the same. Fate had overturned his contract, and his heart would no longer escape the consequences of his choices. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the city washed clean under a pale sky. Yet, inside St. Mary's Hospital, tension clung to the air thicker than the rain clouds. Elena had opened her eyes after months in silence, and with that single act, Alexander's carefully calculated plan had begun to unravel. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, performing tests, adjusting monitors, and recording every flicker of progress. Elena's body was weak, her voice a faint rasp, but her mind fought to surface. Each word she spoke was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through Alexander's world. When the room finally cleared, Alexander remained by her bedside, his posture stiff. He tried to speak with the same commanding tone he used in boardrooms, but his voice wavered. "You need rest. Do not push yourself." Elena turned her head slightly, her eyes glassy yet searching. She looked at the ring on her finger again, lifting her trembling hand with effort. Why am I wearing this?" Alexander's chest tightened. He forced a calm smile, though his palms were damp. "Because you are my wife." The words felt heavy, unnatural, but Elena accepted them in silence, too fragile to argue. Still, the seed of doubt was planted in her gaze. Over the next days, Alexander kept up the performance. He brought flowers to her room, spoke to the doctors as though he were a devoted husband, and stayed late into the night watching over her. To the hospital staff, he was the image of loyalty. To Elena, he was a stranger cloaked in tenderness. One evening, as the sunset poured golden light through the blinds, Elena whispered, "I cannot remember the accident. I cannot remember us." Alexander froze, his hand tightened on the chair arm. He said quickly, "That is normal after trauma. Memories will return with time." She studied his face, her voice thin but steady. "But why do I feel like something is missing? Why does it feel like you are hiding something from me?" Her question pierced deeper than she could know. Alexander turned away, hiding the conflict twisting his features. He wanted to tell her the truth, to confess that their marriage was nothing but ink and desperation. But one confession would cost him everything. Later that night, when Elena had drifted back to sleep, Alexander noticed a small notebook on the bedside table. Its cover was worn, edges frayed. Curious, he opened it. Inside were sketches, simple pencil drawings Elena had made before the accident. Small flowers, cityscapes, faces of strangers she must have passed on the street. And at the back, unfinished, was a sketch of a man. The lines of his jaw were sharp, his shoulders broad, but the details of his eyes and expression were left blank, as though she had not yet decided who he was meant to be. Alexander closed the book slowly, unsettled. Was fate mocking him? She had drawn the outline of a man she had never truly met, and now he was sitting here, pretending to be that figure. He whispered into the quiet, "I am lying to you, Elena. But I cannot stop now." The next morning, Elena's strength grew. She began asking more questions, small ones that pried at the walls he had built. The pressure mounted with every interaction. Alexander knew the truth would not remain buried forever, and when it came out, it would destroy more than his inheritance. It would shatter the fragile trust glowing in her recovering eyes. As he left the hospital that day, Alexander's reflections stared back at him in the glass doors. For the first time, the powerful millionaire saw a man cornered not by rivals or contracts, but by his own deceit. Days turned into weeks, and Elena's recovery became the quiet rhythm of Alexander's new life. He continued to visit St. Mary's Hospital almost every evening after long hours at the company. To the outside world, he looked like a man balancing empire and devotion. To Elena, he was a puzzle, gentle in his presence, yet distant in his soul. The doctors encouraged light therapy and simple exercises. One afternoon, Alexander entered her room to find her sitting upright, sketchbook on her lap. Her hands trembled as she guided a pencil across the page, but her determination made the lines steady enough to form the outline of a flower. She looked up and smiled faintly. "They told me drawing could help rebuild my memory, so I am trying." Alexander stepped closer, surprised by the warmth that flickered in his chest. "You liked drawing before?" Elena nodded. "It was my way to hold on to little things. Faces, places, dreams. Things that fade too quickly otherwise." She tilted the sketchbook toward him. "Do you want to see?" He hesitated, then took it carefully. Page after page revealed pieces of her world skylines, small details of markets, children laughing on a street corner. They were not grand, not polished, but full of life. For a moment, Alexander felt as though he was stepping into a reality far removed from marble offices and family wealth. "You have talent," he said quietly. Elena studied him, her eyes softer than before. "You say it as though you mean it, but your voice always sounds guarded. Why?" The question struck him harder than any boardroom confrontation. He masked the storm inside and simply replied, "It has always been difficult for me to show what I feel." She accepted his answer, but her gaze lingered with quiet curiosity. Over the following days, Alexander found himself staying longer at the hospital. He would bring her small comforts, fresh fruit, soft blankets, even books she might enjoy. Sometimes they spoke about simple things, the changing weather, childhood memories she was beginning to recall, the music she used to love. Other times they sat in silence, yet the air between them grew less heavy, as if the unspoken truth had been pushed aside by fragile threads of connection. One evening, Elena showed him a sketch she had started. It was a portrait of him, though incomplete. His jawline was drawn with careful precision, his shoulders defined, but his eyes were only shadows. "I cannot decide what they look like yet," she admitted. "Eyes should tell the truth, but yours, they keep secrets from me." Alexander stared at the drawing, the unfinished eyes haunting him. He wanted to confess everything, to free himself from the lie, but when he saw the trust in her fragile smile, the words died in his throat. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "Finish it when you are ready," he said. "Perhaps then, I will be ready too." That night, as he left the hospital, Alexander realized something terrifying. The marriage had begun as a shield, a contract designed to protect his empire. Yet every passing day with Elena was dissolving that illusion. The woman he had chosen for convenience was teaching him patience, humility, and something he had long buried: kindness. The empire still demanded his attention. Meetings, mergers, and power struggles filled his days. But when the sun set, it was Elena's quiet strength that drew him back to her side. And slowly, without warning, the walls Alexander had built around his heart began to crack. He did not know it yet, but the man who once thought love was a weakness was already learning the hardest truth. No contract could control the pull of a genuine connection, and no empire could protect him from the risk of falling in love with the woman he had deceived. The chill of autumn had begun to seep into the city. Leaves turned shades of amber and gold, and the air carried a crispness that hinted winter was not far away. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, Elena had grown stronger. She could now walk short distances with the help of a nurse, and her voice had gained more strength. Each day, her memory seemed to reach a little further back, pulling fragments from before the accident. Alexander watched her progress with a mixture of pride and dread. Her laughter, fragile but genuine, had become the one sound that stayed in his mind long after he left the hospital. Yet behind his admiration lay fear. The more she remembered, the closer she came to discovering the truth he had hidden. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alexander entered her room to find her sitting by the window. The sketchbook was in her lap again, but her expression was troubled. She looked up when he approached, and her eyes were sharper than usual. "Alexander," she said slowly, "something has been bothering me." He steadied himself, forcing a calm tone. "What is it?" She hesitated, then held up a thin envelope she had found in the drawer of his chair. Inside were copies of documents, legal pages with her name printed in black ink. Her hand trembled as she pulled one out. Why does this say marriage agreement? Why are there signatures of lawyers and not ours? The air seemed to freeze around him. For a moment, Alexander could not breathe. He had been careless. Those papers were supposed to be locked away. Elena, he began, his voice low. It is complicated. Her voice cracked as she pressed. Complicated? You married me when I was unconscious. You made me your wife without my consent. Why? He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back as if his touch burned. Guilt surged through him, heavy and suffocating. At the time, I believed you would never wake. My grandfather's will demanded I marry to secure the inheritance. I thought, his voice faltered, I thought it would not matter. Her eyes filled with tears, but there was steel in her tone. Not matter? My life, my dignity, my right to choose, all of that did not matter. The truth hung between them like broken glass. Alexander's empire, built on control and strategy, could not shield him from the raw wound in her voice. She rose unsteadily, leaning on the chair for balance, but her anger gave her strength. You have lied to me from the beginning. Every flower, every word of comfort. It was all a mask, was it not? He shook his head desperately. No. At first, yes, it was a lie. But now it is different. I care for you, Elena. More than I can admit. She laughed bitterly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Care? How can you speak of care when you built this on betrayal? She yanked the ring from her finger, her hand trembling, and threw it onto the bed. The small band of gold rolled across the blanket, stopping between them like a symbol of everything broken. I will not be part of your empire. I will not be your contract, she whispered, her voice breaking. Without another word, she turned away, her fragile frame moving toward the door. Alexander stood frozen, his chest aching with a pain he had never known. The sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway was louder than any boardroom defeat. For the first time, the man who had conquered industries realized he had lost something far greater: trust. And no amount of wealth or power could buy it back. The days that followed were unbearable for Alexander. He had faced ruthless competitors, financial crises, and boardroom betrayals, but nothing compared to the silence Elena left behind. She had moved out of St. Mary's Hospital into a rehabilitation center across the city, refusing his visits, refusing his calls. For the first time in his life, Alexander's wealth and power meant nothing. His office, once a place of triumph, now felt like a prison. Meetings blurred together. Numbers on financial reports lost meaning. Every night he found himself staring at the empty glass of whiskey on his desk, hearing Elena's voice echo in his memory. My life, my dignity, my right to choose, all of that did not matter. One night, desperate, Alexander returned to the hospital room that had been Elena's. The bed was empty, the walls stripped bare, but on the bedside table he found something that made his chest ache. It was her sketchbook, the one she had used during recovery. He opened it slowly. The final pages revealed her private thoughts. There were sketches of small dreams, a cottage by a lake, a table set for two, a child holding balloons, and scrawled between the drawings were words written in shaky handwriting. I only ever wanted a simple life with someone who truly cared. Alexander pressed the book against his chest, his breath breaking. For years he had been chasing empires, yet in her fragile lines and words, he saw the truth. He had stolen her choice, her trust, and yet she still dreamed of love that was honest. He knew then that no amount of contracts or inheritances could heal what he had broken. Redemption would require more than apologies whispered in the dark. It would demand sacrifice. The next morning, he made a decision that stunned his family. Alexander walked into the board meeting, holding the inheritance papers his grandfather's lawyers had finalized. Without hesitation, he placed them on the table. I am relinquishing my claim, he declared. Gasps filled the room. I will not hold an empire built on lies. If the price of keeping my wealth is betraying the woman He stopped, swallowing hard. The woman I love, then it is not worth it. The board erupted in chaos, but Alexander did not waver. For the first time, his power came not from money, but from the truth in his voice. That evening, he left the towering glass building behind and drove straight to the rehabilitation center. His heart pounded as he entered, clutching Elena's sketchbook. He found her sitting near a window, her eyes distant, her body still frail but upright. When she saw him, her expression hardened. "Why are you here, Alexander? I told you I did not want to see you." He stepped closer, his voice raw. "Because I cannot let you believe that everything was a lie. I gave up the inheritance. I walked away from it all. I am no longer bound by my grandfather's will. The only thing I want is the chance to earn your trust, not as your husband by contract, but as a man who finally understands what love means." He held out her sketchbook, open to the page with the unfinished portrait. "You left my eyes blank. I want you to see them now, without secrets, without masks." Elena's breath caught. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time since awakening, she saw not the ruthless millionaire, but a man stripped bare by remorse. Whether she could forgive him or not was still uncertain. But in that moment, Alexander had taken his first step toward redemption. And this time, it was not for wealth, not for power, but for love. The decision Alexander made shook his entire world. Within days, news spread across the city's financial district. The heir to one of the greatest empires had publicly renounced his inheritance. Newspapers printed bold headlines, and television anchors debated his motives. Some called it foolish, others whispered it was noble. For Alexander, none of the noise mattered. What mattered was the truth. Soon, the weight of his confession reached his grandfather. The old man, weakened and frail, asked to see him. Alexander went to the mansion where the patriarch of the family lay surrounded by lawyers and relatives hungry for fortune. The moment Alexander stepped inside, all eyes turned on him, some filled with scorn, others with disbelief. His grandfather's voice was rough but firm. "Is it true, Alexander? Did you throw away everything for a woman?" Alexander met his gaze without hesitation. "It is true. I married Elena under false pretenses to claim your empire. I lied to her. I lied to you. But when she opened her eyes, I saw the man I had become. Wealth without honor is nothing but poison. If it costs me the empire to protect her dignity, then I will pay that price." "Oh." The room erupted in murmurs, but the old man raised his hand. He stared at Alexander for a long time, his eyes moist. Finally, a faint smile appeared. "At last, you understand. Love and truth are heavier than gold. That is the lesson I wanted you to learn." The lawyers protested, but the patriarch silenced them. "If my empire falls into the wrong hands, let it. I will not see my grandson become a prisoner of greed. Alexander, you may yet prove yourself, not by contracts, but by how you protect what you love." The confrontation became public days later. Reporters crowded outside the mansion as Alexander stepped forward, Elena's sketchbook in his hand. Microphones were thrust toward him. One journalist shouted, "Is it true your marriage was a sham? Did you marry a woman in a coma to seize your grandfather's wealth?" The crowd buzzed, cameras flashing. Alexander raised his voice, steady and clear. "Yes, it began as a lie. I married Elena when she could not speak, when she could not choose. I justified it as business, but it was a betrayal of her trust. And for that, I will carry the shame all my life." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another reporter asked, "Then why confess now? Why destroy your reputation?" Alexander opened the sketchbook and showed the unfinished portrait Elena had drawn. "Because love built on deception is no love at all. I do not deserve her forgiveness, but I will not hide behind contracts and wealth any longer. I would rather lose everything than silence her truth." The scene was broadcast across the nation. For many, it was the first time they saw a man of power willing to expose his own disgrace for the sake of another's dignity. In that moment, Alexander's empire no longer defined him. His actions did. Back at the rehabilitation center, Elena watched the press conference on the small television in the lounge. Her heart ached as she heard his words. The man who had once bound her to a loveless marriage was now standing before the world, stripped of pride, offering his vulnerability in place of power. Tears welled in her eyes. She whispered to herself, "Maybe he truly has changed." The story was no longer hidden in hospital rooms or private contracts. It was out in the open, where truth and justice could no longer be denied. And for the first time since waking, Elena felt a fragile spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, love could be reborn from the ruins of betrayal. The days after Alexander's public confession were filled with silence for Elena. She carried his words inside her, turning them over like stones in her hands. For so long, she had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she never asked to play. Yet now, the man who had deceived her stood before the world stripped of pride, stripped of wealth, but clothed in something he had never shown before: humility. One evening, the sky was painted in soft shades of orange and gold when Alexander arrived quietly at the rehabilitation center. He did not come with reporters or lawyers. He carried nothing but a small box and the sketchbook Elena had once left behind. She was sitting by the garden, her blanket draped across her shoulders. The autumn air was cool, and fallen leaves surrounded her chair. When she looked up and saw him, her breath caught, but she did not move. Alexander walked slowly, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Elena, I came not as the man you were forced to marry, not as the heir to an empire, but as a man who has nothing left to hide. I broke your trust once. Today, I ask for a chance to rebuild it." He placed the sketchbook in her lap, opened to the portrait she had left unfinished. Then he lowered himself to one knee and opened the box, revealing the same gold ring she had once thrown away. This time, there is no contract, no condition, no inheritance, waiting at the other end. This is not about duty, this is about choice. Elena, will you choose me not as a name on paper, but as the man who loves you? Tears shimmered in her eyes. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she touched the sketch, her pencil marks faint yet alive. She whispered, "I left your eyes unfinished because I could not see the truth in them. But now I do." Her hand trembled as she took the ring from the box and slid it onto her own finger. "Yes, Alexander, this time it is real." Relief flooded him. He rose, wrapping her gently in his arms, careful of her fragile frame. For the first time, they kissed not as strangers bound by a contract, but as two souls who had finally found each other through trials of lies, redemption, and courage. The world outside still debated wealth and scandal, but for them, it no longer mattered. The empire was no longer Alexander's crown, and the hospital was no longer Elena's prison. Together, they carried only one truth: love chosen freely is stronger than any fortune. And so, the marriage that began as the coldest lie ended as the truest vow, sealed not by law or inheritance, but by the unbreakable bond of two hearts choosing each other at last.